Thank you, Ms. Hughes, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Our topic today is Sherman Alexie's commonly challenged book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. So, Ms. Hughes, you've been a teacher for how long?
A long time, about 40 years actually, if you also include the time that I was a school guidance counselor.
Okay.
And what grades and subjects have you taught?
I have taught middle school and high school mostly, although I've also taught some fourth, fifth grade as well. And I've taught English for 10 years, and I taught social studies for 5 years, and I've been teaching prevention education, kind of like health education, for 9 years. And then I was a school guidance counselor as well.
So we just want to jump right into asking questions about the book. So we first just wanted to know what you thought of The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian.
Personally, I love the book. I think it's really well written. I think it raises some important social issues. I think it's also funny. So it's a combination of both being heart-wrenching as well as humorous, and and the fact that it's semi-autobiographical adds even more power to the narrative.
What are the most controversial topics from a teacher's point of view in the book?
Yeah. I think the sexuality references are the most controversial, particularly when they talk about masturbation. And it's just very raw and very direct. If I were a teenage boy reading this book, I would love this book because I think Sherman Alexie captures how teenage boys talk to each other sometimes. So I think it's realistic. However, as a teacher, I would be concerned about the reaction I'd be getting from parents with the sexuality. There's also references to boners. Excuse me. There's cursing in the book, but I think in this day and age, that's less of an issue than the sexuality. There are controversial issues like alcoholism and bullying. But again, those issues I think have come to be accepted as being okay for young adult literature. It's the sexuality that's going to be the issue.
With you mentioned the biggest issue being sexuality. Why is that a controversial topic to a teacher, more controversial for a teacher compared to a parent or administrator?
I'm thinking about that. I don't know that it is more controversial for a teacher than an administrator, but it's controversial because we have to answer to parents. And if parents are objecting to the book, then that creates some challenges. In the past, when I have taught things that were controversial, like I remember many years ago when I taught Romeo and Juliet, I showed a movie version of Romeo and Juliet. And in one of the scenes, you see Romeo's bare butt because he and Juliet have just spent the night. I had to, now this was many years ago, but I had to pretty much write a letter home to all the parents before I showed the film, letting them know what I was doing and giving them the option that their child could opt out if the parents weren't comfortable with that. So this book, with its direct talk about masturbation in pretty, I won't say vulgar because it's not vulgar, but it's kind of crude. It's like the way boys would talk to each other. Parents are going to have a hard time with that, which means then teachers are going to have a hard time with it because they're going to have to answer to the parents. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So even though you mentioned some controversial topics in the book, would you still be willing to teach this book in a class? Why or why not? And then if so, what age group do you think would be best to teach this book?
Personally, I would love to teach the book. I think it would depend upon the school and the setting if I would be allowed to teach the book. Some of my years were spent in Catholic education. I doubt that I would be able to teach this book in a Catholic school.
Yeah.
I'm actually, while I understand why Sherman Alexie put in the sexuality scenes, I'm sort of sorry that he did, because it limits, I think, where the book can be taught. I could teach this book in a public school if I had a liberal administrator and a liberal parent, group of parents. I think this book would be fantastic for alternative school kids, particularly if I were teaching, and I did for like 5 years. I taught an alternative school on the high school level, and I had also taught for 2 years an alternative school on the middle school level. For alternative school kids, this would be great because they'd be able to relate to it. I don't think this book would be shocking to them. I think it would pique their interest. I probably would teach this book on the high school level just because some of the content is mature. Right now, I teach prevention education, but I teach at a middle school. And anytime you say the word fart, not that I say the word, but the boys in the class will say the word fart, and then everybody breaks into peals of laughter. And if I say anything that even remotely could be misinterpreted on a sexual level, they love those double entendres. So my fear in teaching this book on the middle school level is that they wouldn't have the maturity to handle it, and if they're laughing at fart, they're really gonna go crazy at some of the other references.
What are important lessons or themes from any book that you think students, specifically young adults, should learn?
Okay, again, that's a really good question. One theme that I think is really important is tolerance and appreciation of diversity and differences. And this book certainly deals with that. Young adults are also coming to terms with identity and who are they in the world. And again, here you have a part-time Indian. He's really struggling with his identity and his race. Given how charged the current atmosphere is politically in the United States, especially around issues of race, I think it is absolutely crucial that books begin to address those issues in a way that is helpful and positive rather than divisive. And I think this book does that. I also think that young adult literature needs to not only talk about the problems, but offer some insight into solutions or ways to handle those problems. And one of the things I absolutely love about this Absolutely True Diary is that you have a main character who finds a way to survive the racism, the poverty, the alcoholism. He survives, and he does it in a way that is honest and in a way that is brave. So this book, one of the reasons I like this book is it provides a positive role model. So in answer to your question, Taylor, it's really important, I think, that books, in addition to exposing the problems, also provide role models on positive ways to handle those problems.
Going back to Sherman Alexie's book, the book takes place in a setting not really known to the Midwest. So how do you think this story would still benefit young adults, even though it's not a place that many students have ever lived?
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things I've been thinking about. How universal is this book? Because it is specifically about a Native American growing up on a reservation. And I think it's really universal. I think this book is a nice combination of having an interesting story with a unique setting that a lot of white Americans are not familiar with, so it's going to be interesting to them, as well as some universal themes like who am I? Where do I fit in? How do I make my way in the world? What are my dreams? How can I overcome the obstacles? What about friendships? How do I make friends? How do I handle bullying? How do I handle moving to a new school? How does the family of origin I came from impact my life? And how can I value my family while at the same time make decisions to be different than my family and choose a different path? Those are universal themes that I think all teenagers would benefit from. Plus coming of age and just, your body's changing. You are becoming more aware of your feelings about the people you're sexually attracted to. And this book also, makes reference to that issue.
If you were teaching a book that you knew had controversial themes in it, how would you go about preparing for it?
Yeah. I would probably send a letter home saying we're going to be talking about a book that deals with these issues. If you have concerns, please talk to me, and please talk to your son or daughter. So that's one thing I would do. I would also have a conversation with the class about, while some things make us uncomfortable and we might laugh at those things that make us uncomfortable, I still want you to take the subject seriously. I would tell the class that I had faith in their maturity. Even if I'm not totally sure that I did, I would set high expectations, and I would say, I am trusting you as a class to be mature enough to handle these themes and these topics. I would also talk with them about how to disagree with each other respectfully, because when there is a controversial book that has hot button issues, students are going to have differing opinions, which is great. I just want them to be able to express those opinions respectfully. And the other thing I would probably do is I would probably do some reading. I know this book has gotten awards. It's a National Book Award. And I would probably do a little bit of reading myself, so that when parents said to me, why are you teaching a book that talks about masturbation, I would like to be able to quote a source other than just my opinion that says this book is worthy of our time and attention.
We were wondering, what are the rules, or like what's the procedure at the schools you've taught at where a parent or a student wants to challenge a book?
I think that varies from school to school. The first thing the parent would do, I believe, would be to contact me as the teacher, and then if they didn't feel satisfied, they would then contact my principal, and then if they didn't feel satisfied, they would contact the school board, or the school, the head administrator of the school district. I was in a school where actually the science textbooks were challenged because there were a group of parents who wanted creationism taught, and they were upset that evolution was being taught without creationism being taught. And it was quite a hot topic, very controversial. There were meetings, lots of meetings between the teachers and the concerned parents, and the school board got pulled in, and ultimately it ended up being a school board decision. So while the process might begin with me, if I were not able to answer the parents' concerns satisfactorily, it would eventually go out of my hands and go to the head of the school board, probably.
I know you mentioned for the science textbook that it was challenged, but has there ever been like an English book that you had to read for an English class that's been banned at a school you've taught?
Say that again. Has there ever been
a book for an English class that's been challenged or banned at a school you've taught at?
I know that there are books that we wouldn't be able to teach. I never was in the situation where I taught a book and it later got pulled or banned. But I have taught at fairly liberal schools. I've taught mostly in St. Louis City. So, for example, I've taught Huck Finn. I've taught, I'm blanking. What is the book with Bigger? He is an African American who kills a white woman. I think you've read that book.
Bigger?
Bigger. Yeah, that's not the name of the book, but that's the name of the main character.
I don't remember.
This book.
Yeah. Anyway, I have taught books that have been on the banned list in other places.
Mm-hmm.
I have never taught a book that was banned in my school.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have to think about the names of some of those books.
You also mentioned for when the science textbook was challenged that there were meetings between, parents and administrators. I was wondering if the students' opinions who were actually, who had been learning the information so far in the semester, if their opinions were taken into account, or if you think it would be beneficial to have students be a part of that conversation.
Good question. I always think it's important to have the students' input. And yes, the students were part of the conversation. However, I don't think the students had a lot of decision-making power, but they did give input.
So, as you can probably guess, this book has been challenged in many places across the United States. And there was actually one particular instance that was very different in Waterloo, Iowa, that we read about for this podcast. And it was a teacher was teaching it in the class, and when one of the parents found out, just one parent challenged it and went over the teacher's head to the curriculum director, and the curriculum director just pulled it off the shelves and sent an email out telling all the teachers not to teach it without any say or anything. And then all the teachers went against the curriculum director, saying, why didn't we get any notice or get to say anything? And then the superintendent looked at it, the complaint, and said, oh, I actually agree with this because I don't like this book, so we're not going to teach it anymore. And they actually do have, this particular school district had a whole process and set in stone what they do when a book's challenged. And it's supposed to be a democratic process, but they kind of just went over the teacher's head. And as far as we know, the teachers this was a recent happening, and the teachers are still kind of fighting this. What are your thoughts what do you think about this whole incidence of what happened over in Iowa?
Okay. I'm not familiar with that incident, but based on what you told me...
Yeah, just based on what I said, yeah.
I think the process sounds like it was autocratic. Like one or two people made the decision for everybody else. And it also sounds like the administrators were scared of parental response and maybe caved in to pressure from the parents without thoroughly investigating the issue. So it sounds to me like the administrators did not do their due diligence. It's important, I think, to get input from all of the constituents, and it's important to hear both sides of the argument, and it doesn't sound like any of that happened. And particularly, I think it's important to hear from the teachers themselves as well as the students, because they are the ones who are most impacted.
And just a follow-up question to that, what are your thoughts, or do you think it's fair how one parent said challenged it and it was completely taken off the shelf? Do you think there should be a certain amount of parents, or?
I think it certainly shouldn't be one parent.
Yeah.
If there's a consensus, there needs to be a lot of discussion. Hopefully some kind of consensus or compromise could be reached. Like I said, in schools where I've taught, where a controversial topic was part of the curriculum, but parents were uncomfortable with that, they did have the option of pulling their child from that class or that child then gets an alternative book to read. One of the schools where I taught, for example, since we're talking about sexuality, health class was required of all of the high school students. Some of the health classes dealt with the topic of contraception and birth control. For those parents who did not want a teacher teaching their child about contraception, there were other health classes that didn't mention birth control or contraception. So there needs to be, I think, a compromise so that books that are of value can be taught, and so that parents who have strong religious objections to something can have an alternative path. But I don't think it's fair that everybody should be deprived of a valuable learning experience on the basis of a handful of people.
Have you ever taught in a school where a book was used in an interdisciplinary setting?
Yes. One of the schools I taught at really valued interdisciplinary courses. So I actually was part of a American Studies class where we had a history teacher, an English teacher, and I'm trying to think if we had a third teacher. But we kind of co-taught the class, and I was the English teacher who taught American literature as part of that. I was also part of a women's studies class, and there we had a history teacher, a literature teacher, and a religion teacher, and the three of us designed the course together and co-taught it. And I loved the interdisciplinary approach. I think it allows students as well as the teachers to see the connectivity of the various subjects, and it allows for a deeper exploration of the material.
Do you think the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian could be used in an interdisciplinary setting? And if so, explain.
No, I hadn't thought about that. But yes, I think that would be terrific. It could be taught both as an English class, and it could also be taught, I think, in a social studies setting, where you're talking about the history of Native Americans, where you're talking about the history of racism in the United States, where you're looking at, in a psychology class, what's the impact of alcoholism on an individual and on a culture as a whole and on the family. If I were teaching a sociology class, this would be a book that I think would be really interesting to look at the sociological implications. There's one point in the book where the main character talks about growing up poor. I'm going to read it to you. I can't help myself as an English teacher. It sucks to be poor, and it sucks to feel that you somehow deserve to be poor. You start believing that you're poor because you're stupid and ugly, and then you start believing that you're stupid and ugly because you're an Indian, and because you're an Indian, you start believing you're destined to be poor. It's an ugly circle, and there's nothing you can do about it. Poverty doesn't give you strength or teach you lessons about perseverance. No, poverty only teaches you how to be poor. Whew. Boy, that's quite a mouthful, and that's a real good explanation of learned helplessness. And I think it could lead to a lot of discussion about the intersectionality of economic disadvantage and racism and how they intersect with each other. So I think that'd be a wonderful idea to read this book as part of a interdisciplinary course. I want to do that.
We were also thinking health too, maybe a health class, because there's a lot of instances of health. Like the sexuality could maybe be brought in a subtle way. But,
And then specifically looking at, maybe for English too, a section for psychological criticism, looking at the certain character's personality, like arrogant, vindictive, would kind of be one, or compliant, like personality. We thought that would be a really good topic to talk about for this book.
Yes, I think so as well. And you could have a conversation about what are healthy ways versus unhealthy ways of handling conflict and all of the problems that that he has to face, that Junior has to face.
We also talked about kind of in the book that a lot of the events are true and are based off of the author's life. And so in an article entitled "Why the Best Kids Books Are Written in Blood," and it's written by Sherman Alexie, he said, "Kids as young as 10 have sent me autobiographical letters written in crayon, complete with drawings inspired by my book, that are just as dark, terrifying, and redemptive as anything I've ever read." So we wanted to ask, how can it be justified or not be justified with content that some view as uncomfortable, like sexual assault, rape, content like that, even if some of the students have witnessed or experienced the uncomfortable content?
One of the reasons that I had said I think this book would work really well in an alternative school is that a lot of the kids in alternative schools have already, in their families and in their life circumstances, had to deal with some very serious problems, just like Sherman Alexie said. And it can be very healing to see yourself reflected in literature, particularly if the main character finds his or her way through those challenges and comes out wiser and stronger. I lost my train of thought here. But you've got to be careful about the age. It's tricky. You've got to be careful about the age at which you expose the children to these issues. If it is someone who doesn't have the maturity to handle this content, it's going to be counterproductive. So I think what you're asking is, what about those people who have not experienced these challenges? Isn't it important for them to understand what other people have to go through? And my answer is yes. I think empathy is really important, and that's one of the beauties of literature, is that it allows you to crawl into another person's skin and to see the world from their point of view and to experience life that you've not lived. And particularly in this world where we're all interrelated and what one person does impacts another person, I think it is crucial that we develop empathy and that we come to understand our interrelatedness and how we impact each other. But my only caveat there is I would want to make sure that the students I exposed to this content were mature enough to handle it.
So our final question is, how does censoring or banning a book with realistic content affect students' sense of reality?
Well, I'm pausing because I'm thinking. I think it goes both ways. I think reality gets reflected in the literature, and I think literature helps create your sense of reality. A teen who doesn't see himself or herself reflected in literature, I think begins to feel invisible and begins to feel like they're not seen, or they don't count, or their struggles are less important than somebody else's struggles. And maybe they begin to doubt their own perspectives. I'm not a teenager, but I've certainly had the experience of reading something that expresses my experience or my feelings, and I've not been able to put it into words, and somebody else has put it into words. And it's very affirming to say, yes, that's it, that's what I feel, that's my life. And I think that not seeing your life reflected undermines your sense of self and your sense of value, and maybe undermines your sense of confidence in your own perspective.
Hold on. I was going to try to rephrase, because that was a really good answer, but that was like, I think she didn't really answer what we were trying to talk about before, right?
Okay.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where we changed. Like, how does censoring or banning a book with realistic content, do you think it could possibly maybe be hurting or helping the kids who haven't gone through the more, like, uncomfortable material we mentioned earlier? Like, the more privileged kids in the class.
So you're asking, will the more privileged kids come away, miss out on having a full spectrum view of what life is like?
Yes, that was more what the question was getting at.
Okay, yes, I definitely do. That's kind of what I was trying to say when I was talking about empathy. I think for those people who have not had those struggles, whatever they may be, reading about them is crucial in giving them not only empathy, but a sense of reality, of a fuller picture of the world. Because I'll go off on my little soapbox here, but I think today we all live in our own little bubble, and we associate with people who look like us and who are in our socioeconomic category and who have our political views, and we can miss out on an awful lot that way. So I think it's, that's the beauty of literature. It can take you places and into lives that you've never seen. It can take you into worlds that you've never been to, and it helps you understand the world.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have for you. Thank you again for letting us interview you.
You're welcome.